So we're going to have a bit of fun and look at data. I'm known as the data guy on Twitter, and I've spent the last 15 years building travel companies and data companies. So what we're going to do today is look at some data to see what's going on. How did the COVID pandemic impact, well, what's going on right now? And then maybe look at some of the current trends and also look at the opportunities and maybe even some company ideas for the future. And my travel companies, we have tens of millions of individual customers and tens of thousands of partners. So we have a lot of data to sift through. One of the best ways to show what's going on is to first look at flights. So what happened with flights during the pandemic? I mean, a lot of this is going to be predictable, but I just want to visualize what happened. So let's have a look. This is air passenger traffic since 1980, split by total domestic and international. And you can see that, I mean, the main takeaway here is every single major crisis, 9/11, SARS, the financial crisis, had pretty much very little effect on air passenger traffic. Until, of course, we get to COVID. Just before there was a massive surge, and then boom, everything fell by about 60%. 3 billion worth of flights, more than that, just collapsed last year. This was what flying was like during the pandemic. This is me doing a little emergency flight. Did not really want to fly, but had to from New York to LA. And whether you look at it from my perspective or my very careful friends in the background, it just was not for everyone. Back to the data. So this is TNT, is travel and tourism, stands for travel and tourism. And you can see the red line is its contribution to GDP growth. And it's pretty much in line with economic growth. And since the financial crisis of 2009, it stayed above economic growth. And then look what happened. I mean, I'm lying with statistics here. You know, you can't even see it on the chart as to what's going on. Let's fix the scale a little bit. And you see, boom, everything fell by 50%. The whole travel and tourism industry fell in terms of revenues by 50%, and tens of millions of jobs were lost. So I'm still staying on the gloom and doom theme. So just bear with me. It's gonna become better in a minute. Back to the air traffic. So let's look at international passenger seats. This is 2019. You can probably guess what's about to happen. We have the huge drop in April and May, and a little bit of a recovery, but not really, right? So it didn't really recover to more than 40% by the end of 2020. And McKinsey projects that air traffic won't get back to 2019 levels until 2024. And if you look at where flies flew from, so from which continent, for international flights, you have Europe as the big leader here, obviously a lot from Asia, but you can just imagine what an impact Europe had, and based off of what happened last year. These are the numbers if we add in 2020. So Europe had 2x the flights cut more than anyone else. Let's go to domestic. Now, the picture here is a little bit different, right? So we have the fall, but it wasn't as pronounced as international, and then actually a much more recovery to the end of the year. And actually now, coming to the end of 2021, we're pretty much close to 2019 levels. So if we look at by continent again, here it's a little bit different. Europe is much less relevant, and Asia and the US are the big sources of domestic flights. And the reason they didn't fall as much, well, obviously there's fewer government restrictions when you're flying domestic, but also China got through the pandemic early on, started to open up. The US, we all know how kind of 50-50 liberal they are in terms of opening up. So much less of effect in terms of domestic passenger seats. Where does this leave us with airlines, right? We can talk a lot about airlines, but what does the future hold? And obviously airlines have to adapt, right? So, and what is one way they had to adapt? And the one interesting thing is that they had to find revenue from somewhere. We all know how many airlines went bankrupt, furloughed a lot of people. Where would they get revenue from? Well, you have to look at the boom, right? What is the boom during the pandemic? It was e-commerce. So how do airlines make the most of e-commerce? Cargo. Unbelievably, in the last, well, it kind of makes sense, but at the start of the pandemic, revenues from cargo went kind of through the roof, and actually that trend is continuing, right? So airlines have to adapt in many ways. This is one of those interesting ways that's happening. So another interesting way to look at what's happened during the pandemic and how countries locked down is to look at hotel stays, right? Presumably, we've got to stay at home. We can't stay in hotels. So now let's look at hotel occupancy. You have Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, and Spain, 5 of the top European countries. Hotel occupancy is the percent of hotel rooms that folks stay in on average per month since the start of 2020, indexed against 2019, right? So this shows relative to what was going on in 2019, and this actually kind of paints a pretty interesting picture of, like, you have the really extreme lockdown in April, May last year, and then things started to open up, and then you have the longer and more kind of pronounced lockdown, which is kind of still meandering, but we're still only at about 75% occupancy in those European countries. And if you add in the UK, it's not too different, despite Brexit. You have it tucked in between Italy and Germany over there. Then this is the interesting one. You have Russia. This is Russia, which pretty much opened up a year ago, right? So you have that kind of spike back up to 2019 levels, and now it's actually suffering more because of low vaccination rates. And Turkey is interesting. So it's somewhere between, tried to mimic Russia, but then got into trouble in April and May. There was this, their curfew in the first 2 weeks of May, which kind of massively impacted hotel stays. And then last but not least, you have the US, which has opened up a little bit like Europe, but much more aggressively. And now it's actually kind of back to 2019 levels in terms of hotel occupancy. Now I want to look at some data for something which is probably more fundamental and happened in parallel with the demand shock. And that's how all of us travel to work, or as the case may be, how we did not travel to work. I want to argue that the remote work thing is not just a passing thing that was here just during the pandemic. For most of us, it's here to stay. We're addicted to remote. So how did this all happen, right? I mean, without kind of stating the obvious, most of us had to work from home last year. But the interesting thing was that there was a surge of people during that time that realized in some part that the world is their office. They didn't have to just work from home. They could actually go out of town and experience new places as they were working, certainly if they could afford to. I remember one data point is that, Airbnb has seen kind of almost a doubling of nights from 1 month long stays, right? So folks realized that they didn't have to just kind of work home. If they were able to, this was an opportunity to experience new places. If we go back to what was going on a year ago, folks didn't actually want to go to the office primarily. So only about a third actually said, look, I want to head back to the office. So you can see a little bit of the trends here. Like, most people want to stay working remote. A lot of them actually kind of want to travel away from their home while working. That's not really good going anywhere. So about 57% of people, even while working remotely, even once restrictions are lifted, want to work, go out of town and work from a new place. And this trend is probably only going to accelerate because pretty much everyone wants to work remotely, at least part of the time. So the metric for this survey ranges anything from 70 to 96%, depending on which survey you look at. So you'd think that, well, it doesn't matter what people want, right? If they're working for companies, surely if the companies just say, look, we need you back in the office, then it wouldn't matter what their employees want. So it turns out that companies are on board too. So job postings, there are about 80% of job postings online right now give the option of remote, right? Up from 30% 2 years ago, right? So companies have already kind of shifted and realized that actually maybe productivity-wise things weren't as bad as they thought they would be at the start of the pandemic. If we look at the future is built by startups, by companies of the future. They're getting started now. So this is a survey done by Initialized Capital a few months ago where founders were asked, where is the optimal place? If there were no restrictions, what is the optimal place to start a company? And it's not any US city, San Francisco Bay Area like it was a couple of years ago. It's now actually remote or in the cloud, right? So the companies of the future that are getting started now, they're starting remote, right? So that 80% metric is only going to keep increasing. So, huge problem here, big elephant in the room, right? All of us worked last year. It was pretty hard, right? I mean, all of us saw that video with the kids in the background and kind of, I don't know how many friends of mine and kind of relationships had so much tension just kind of working on top of each other in the kitchen, right? We've kind of all seen that. So the question is, well, what do we do about that? I mean, if it's hard to work, what do we do about that? And sure enough, so Stanford did a survey where they asked to what extent could you work remotely. Only about 50% of people can work efficiently at home right now. So the question becomes, how do we facilitate this demand? And maybe there's a huge opportunity to figure out the right supply. Whether it's a co-living space, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a new type of house that people will move into as they're built in the cities of the future. Where is the supply coming from, right? And so this gives me an idea, and I want to end with what is my vision for the future in the context of travel. And I came up with an idea to help us frame these inevitable shifts that are happening, and I call it the big switch. Up until recently, and actually trends started going against this recently, and it kind of accelerated during the pandemic, but up until recently, if you were ambitious and you wanted to be productive, this was the American dream, right? You worked in a busy city where you built connections, you had your job, and then if you could afford it, if you had the time, if you had the money, you would escape every few weeks somewhere where you could relax, right? And the big switch says is that this American dream, this notion of the American dream is actually going to be inverted. So now what's going to happen, or it's already happening, has been accelerated by the pandemic, is that we're going to work wherever is most comfortable for us. Usually it's typically away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and it's where it's convenient. But cities are not going anywhere. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago. It's buzzing. People are saying it's the best New York has ever been. So the cities are not going anywhere. So our new army of remote workers, what do they do with cities? Well, they go to their cities for their socializing and their building connections fix, which they can't do remotely, right? So now, obviously, this is not applicable to all. Only 40% of people are in jobs where they can't even physically work on a beach or remotely. But if we frame this as a mental model, it gives us some clues as to what the vision holds. So let's think about how the big switch can be applied to a number of travel-related areas. First is hotels. Second one around cities. Third is travel-related guidance and community. So I believe that hotels are going to shift from the cookie-cutter business experience that we have on the left to engaging community experiences, as you can see kind of the Soho Hotel type photo on the right. And so why is that? Well, the big switch tells us that we expect a much higher quality of life because we got that experience from remote. And now we want to go to hotels as a change of scene to work and also to socialize more. The second thing is that a lot of the spaces, companies are now shifting remote, right? So far fewer companies need to be based in the city. So suddenly we have all this empty space that's potentially available for new hotels and new co-living opportunities. And the opportunity here is to build the engaging community experiences and co-living spaces that hotels will be transforming into. On the side of cities, the big switch tells us that there's a lot less demand for the experience on the left, which is our busy street in San Francisco. I'm completely unbiased because I moved out of San Francisco a couple of years ago, to something that's on the right, which is obviously extreme, but you get the idea of the possibilities here. And right now we're in a situation with cities where people can really vote with their feet. We've seen this trend to cities. So those cities that can provide the experience and the socializing and the connections in a way that is amenable to what we now need and expect are going to win in the coming years. In fact, I predict that in the next few years, we're going to see new cities and towns and communes who are going to actually make the most of this and draw people in because of the quality of the experience that they're providing. And now on to travel guidance. So a lot of people think that travel agents are dead and they're not going anywhere. Now, I actually think they're more important than ever. They just need to be reimagined in a way that's relevant given the big switch idea. So before, travel agents would cater for the mass market, and now the big switch tells us that we're living like a local in lots of new places where we're staying for longer stays. But who's going to provide us that guidance as to what exactly are the best experiences in those areas. And so the future is a new type of independent travel agent. And all of you probably know a few of those people. You probably know them as an influencer. So there's anyone who is curious about new places and has an audience can become an independent, successful travel agent. Now, the opportunity is to build the tools for those type of people to be successful and as effective as possible for a large number of people. Finally, connections. And perhaps the biggest problem in terms of the future, which is if we're all kind of remote and making the most of the quality of life there, the big thing that's missing are the connections, the human touch and the connections. So where are we going to get that from? So during the pandemic, one of my friends and her fiance organized a set of trips where for 2 weeks at a time, 10 to 15 people would get together and work productively during the day and then build connections and friendship kind of through various activities in the evening. And we went to various places which we'd never really been to, let alone worked from, like New Mexico, Hawaii, and Palm Springs, right? So maybe many of us have been there, but I don't know about you, but I had never worked from out of those places. And what we found was that the human touch and the connection from something like that was just much more rewarding and palpable and has the capacity to build a long-term friendship than the cliche kind of business drinks. Hopefully that painted a little bit of a picture as to what the future holds. Our ancestors long ago were part of nomadic tribes that were much more mobile than we are today. They moved around if they could afford to, less for financial reasons, but more just physical and lack of transportation reasons, to areas that were comfortable for them. So I actually think that the next generation, a big percent of them, are going to go back to the future in that sense. And this is actually going to be, and what's exciting here, that's going to be a better and happier world for all, because it's much more equitable. People can now choose to live where they want to and still get the salary that their skills deserve. So I'm excited about the future. There's so many opportunities here, and we just need to build the future together now. Thank you very much.